But it's a real pleasure for me to introduce Alan. In fact, when I started getting interested in agricultural biotechnology, the first book that I actually checked out from the library was Alan McHughen's book, Pandora's Picnic Basket. And I think that really got me off to a really firm foundation on understanding the science and on understanding the debate. And also, it was argumentative. Alan did take a position in that. Alan is an excellent example for you as a good science communicator. Pandora's Picnic Basket won an award for being effective science communication, if I have this right, by the Canadian Science Writers Association. So I think he's a good model for you on how to communicate science effectively to the public. It's a wonderful book. It has lots of clever titles throughout each chapter. And so it's a real pleasure. So please welcome Alan.
Okay. Are we on okay? Excellent. Good. Okay, well, Jane said, I'm Alan McHughen. I'm at UC Riverside at the moment. I spent a number of years in Saskatchewan in an agriculture department where I learned about agriculture and food production. My prior history was as a student of molecular genetics before even genetic engineering and biotechnology came along. So I do go way back in history. I think this is a great format. You know, good number of people in here. You're all interested in these subjects, so let's try to keep this informal. And if I say something that sparks some curiosity or debate, just put your hand up and let me know, because I think it's more important to have these discussions than to listen to this. But in order to get the thought processes going, we're going to start off with a pop quiz. This is based on a Food Policy Institute survey from several years ago, and I took some of the questions that they asked in the survey across the country, a national poll, and I thought I would share these with you. So if you're all ready, we'll start with some of these questions. Are genetically modified foods in U.S. supermarkets today? You don't have to answer these out loud. All right, don't give it away if you know the answer. But think about that. And, you know, what's your gut reaction? Are we buying genetically modified, genetically engineered, bioengineered, transgenic foods in our supermarkets today? And I'm just using GM because that's the common, as incorrect as it may be, genetically modified is in common parlance. Do ordinary tomatoes contain genes? Would a tomato with a fish gene taste fishy? These are cute, aren't they? I mean, the survey itself, the original survey, of course, was a huge, long survey, and it asked a lot of questions that were unrelated to biotechnology. But these are some of the questions that were biotech related, so I extracted them for our purpose here. If you ate a genetically modified fruit, would it alter your own genes? I want to think about that for a little bit. Can animal genes be inserted into a plant? Do we have the technology to take a gene from an animal and transfer it into a plant? And then finally, can you think of an example, if you believe that such products are on the market, an example of a GM food that's currently on the market in the U.S.? Okay? All right, we're all set? Got your answers? All right. Now, what I've done here is taken the results from this survey, and again, it was across the country. U.S. adults were asked these questions, and others, and what I'm showing here is the percentage of respondents who got the correct answer, right? Who got the correct answer, and these, except for the final one, these are binary. They're either yes or no. So, how do you compare with your cohort of adult Americans? Well, when they're asked if GM foods are in U.S. supermarkets, only 48%, less than half, recognize that we're currently consuming foods made from recombinant DNA technologies. Right? Most people do not believe that they are currently on the market. Do ordinary tomatoes contain genes? Only 40%. Only 40% of U.S. adults recognize that every living thing, including tomatoes, contains genes. Right? Most people are not aware that DNA is in tomatoes and other fruits and vegetables and animals and microbes. Would a tomato with a fish gene taste fishy? 42% correctly identified that a single gene probably would not impart the taste of a fish on a tomato. Right? Most people think it would. If you ate a GM fruit, might it alter your own genes? 45% got it correct, which means the majority of respondents believe that eating a genetically modified fruit would be a mutagen. It would change the DNA inside themselves. I find this really scary, right? I mean, if I identified something that was presented to me as a luncheon item and it would change my DNA, do you think that would get anywhere near my mouth? I would hope not, but here we have it. Can we transfer animal genes into a plant? 70% said no. 70% of adult Americans said no. We can't transfer animal genes into a plant. And then finally, an example of a GM food on the market. You know, most people are thinking of the Flavor Saver tomato or the fish in the tomato or something else, I suppose. And again, you know, this is wrong. There are no genetically modified tomatoes on the market at the moment. Was in the past. The Flavor Saver was on the market. A couple of others were approved. But today and in 2005, when they conducted this survey, there were no tomatoes actually available for sale to consumers. Now, I have to tell you this, you know, I cherry-picked these questions. They related to biotech. Okay, so it's not entirely scientific, but it gives you an indication of what the great public is thinking, where their mindset is on agricultural food biotechnology. And it's not particularly encouraging. I've always been a scientist that worked in a public university. I'm paid by taxpayers, so I feel responsible to taxpayers. And results like this reinforce why I, at least, have decided to spend more and more of my professional time trying to communicate basic science to the great scientific illiterate that's amongst our society. The other interesting thing about food biotechnology, you'll notice that in all of these questions, less than half the populace got the correct answer. And what this indicates, again, it's not scientifically valid, but it's an indicator that, you know, with the first 5 questions, these are binary, yes and no. People who didn't know the answer, right, guessing one way or the other, you'd expect the results to be closer to 50%, right? For every person guessing yes, another person would guess no. But since these are all below 50%, what this indicates, and what you won't find in something, if a similar survey were conducted on, say, nanotechnology, where you probably would get 50%, because nobody knows much about nanotechnology, many of these people thought they knew the answer. And what they believed to be true was wrong. So it's not like we're starting with a blank slate and people are interested in knowing. They already feel that they do know, and they don't need any more information. Okay? So it makes our job, biotechnology, public scientists involved in biotechnology and public education, that much harder, because we have to overcome false beliefs, false assumptions, and so on in many cases. So that's where I come from. I mean, this illustrates why I spend more and more of my time talking to the public. I don't care whether they, at the end of the day, decide they don't like biotechnology or whether they're supportive of it. What concerns me is that if we want to have a healthy and vital, informed democracy, we need to have accurate information, basic information on, you know, what is the science. The fact that DNA is a normal constituent of every living thing. for one example. People should know that before they enter the debate. And if they don't, they're going to get in trouble. They could end up deciding, and I've seen this a number of times talking to people, they end up deciding, their final position on what they think about agricultural biotechnology against their own beliefs and against their own better interests. But they think they're doing the right thing. So that's, I think that's unhealthy in a modern society. Okay, science in everyday life. We know this is increasing. You think of computer technology and cell phones, things that are happening within the computer. These raise privacy issues. You're probably not aware, unless you're an expert in this field, you're not aware of just how much information about you is out there in the wide world that people can access, people who have the information and knowledge can access. It may be scary, it may be not. Molecular genetics and genetic engineering, we'll talk about that a little bit more as we go on. But clearly, a major issue in society today, not only in agriculture, but medicine, a number of other issues that we'll get into as well. Agriculture and food, of course, the whole face of food production is changing on a worldwide basis. Not only biotechnology, but other technologies that are being developed for food and agriculture. Globalization and climate change, so we'll learn more about that apparently this afternoon as we're talking about climate change. And I'm looking forward to that because I know, I'm an interested, concerned citizen, but my expertise is elsewhere. Nanotechnology, again, another one of the areas that is going to be explored in your time here. Again, a very exciting area, but also one that creates a certain degree of anxiety among people when they hear something about it. Weapons of mass destruction, we didn't have to deal with these things a generation ago, right? We really didn't have to, and you could get by, your grandparents probably lived, if they weren't scientifically inclined, they had a full productive life even without getting involved in any of these things. But nowadays, you have to know at least a little bit about science in everyday life. But the problem is, as we've seen from the previous survey results, scientific literacy is diminishing. Right? People are approaching science. They finish a few classes perhaps in high school. They decide, well, science isn't for me. I don't like it. I'm going to avoid it, and try to do so, but at their own peril. When we look at science in modern society, we can see that the technology is often running ahead of our ability to discuss, to deliberate, and deal with the consequences of these things. Right? Any given technology has, one would expect, some positive benefits and some negative attributes. And when you're having a vital debate, you have to be aware of what both of those things are. And then you balance them off. Right? You decide whether the benefits are worth the risks. And sometimes you would end up deciding yes, they are, and other times you decide no, they aren't. But that's, again, that's up to society to discuss. And society, if they're not informed on the basic information of the science involved, they're going to end up making the wrong decisions, again, at their own peril. If, in genomics area alone, if you take something like Huntington's disease, devastating, it's one of the few medical conditions that's determined almost entirely genetically. Okay? It's a simple genetic motif within a gene. You either have it or you don't. If you have that motif, you are going to come down with Huntington's sometime in your 40s. It's fatal. There's no treatment. There's no cure. It's essentially a death sentence. Testing has been available for this gene for some time, and you might say, well, that's great. If we can test people, it's a simple genetic test, the cost is minimal. Why wouldn't you do that and find out and make your plans accordingly? Either providing great relief, if Huntington's runs in your family, you might want to get this test and either determine, okay, I don't have it, so I don't have to worry anymore, continue to live my life. Or you find out that I do have the gene, therefore, I'll live my life accordingly, get my affairs in order before I get into my mid-40s and so on. It gets more interesting when I say we're running ahead of society's ability to deal and deliberate with these things. When you consider, perhaps unusual, but not all that unusual situations where you have something like identical twins, right, who share genomes, where one of the siblings wants to take the test and the other one doesn't. What do we do? Because I mean, we do have privacy rights, and if people don't want to take the test, they shouldn't have to take the test. But clearly, if you're one of the twins, the one that doesn't want to have the test, and your sibling does and goes ahead and has a test, there's no way you can keep that secret, right? I mean, you'll know just how your sibling reacts when he or she gets the results, whether they have it, and of course, if they have it, you have it. So that's a tough question. And that's just, Huntington's disease. I don't know that we've actually encountered that yet, but I can tell you that most of the people who are at risk from Huntington's choose not to get the test. They choose not to know. Okay? And that's true for many of these medical conditions, polycystic kidneys and so on. Not as devastating, obviously, and more easily treatable, but people sometimes they just don't want to know. If that's God's will or if it's nature's will that I have this, well, I'll deal with it at the time. And as a society, we have to respect that, and we've decided to respect that as much as we can. Nowadays, we can get our genome analyzed. The first genomic analysis, the human sequence, cost millions of dollars. Now you can get your whole genome analyzed, not base per base, but at least the variable portions for less than $1,000, right? Over a million sites that tend to vary from person to person for less than $1,000, and that price is dropping dramatically. And I suggest that within a couple of years, 3, 4, the price will be somewhere on the order of $100 to $200, right? You just send in a cheek swab, they run it on a poly reader, your microarray, and send the results back, and for all of these regions, which consists of a number of sites, some of them fairly frivolous, like your blood type, others more important, like whether you're going to get Huntington's or not. And there's a lot of debate about this in society, the ethics of this. It's being now regulated in both California and New York, where some of these companies that do offer this service are being regulated largely because of the concern that most people don't know how to interpret the results, right? I mean, they get this spreadsheet back, and they look up and they say they're at increased risk of getting breast cancer, and that can be devastating news, particularly if it doesn't run in your family and you never thought that I'm at risk for breast cancer, and the anxiety associated with that kind of realization can be very high, and we really want to frighten people when their increased risk is only 0.001% or something. Meaningless. Anyway, I thought of this example as well, baby shopping. If you're a couple that wants to adopt a baby and you want to make sure it's appropriate, you can go to some agencies, make a short list of half a dozen prospective babies, and then ask for a DNA sample, cheek swab from these kids, send them off to the companies at a couple $100 each, and in the greater scheme of adoption, $1,200, $1,500 is pretty small. And you get back the results. You can scan through and say, okay, baby number 3 is the one that we want, because these other babies have deficiencies. It may be they have some predisposition to some nasty disease and we don't want to have to deal with that, or they may have reduced intelligence levels. Their interpretation of the results is that this child may have reduced intelligence potential, or it may be something entirely frivolous. This kid's hair color wouldn't fit in with our family. What are the ethics of that? All right? Not only the mere fact that we're now baby shopping and we can look at the child's genetic future, but also, are we not violating that baby's privacy? Right? I mean, people who are strangers, for the 5 of the 6 kids who don't get selected, first of all, are they going to feel rejected somehow? Secondly, Rejected on what basis? I mean, am I going to grow up and come down with Huntingtons? I don't know the results, right? But these strangers who rejected me as a child, they know my genetic and medical predispositions. Is that appropriate? Is that right? Do we really want to share so much intimate information with strangers? We haven't discussed these things in society. Have we, Paul? No. And then surreptitious DNA collection and analysis. You may not want to know your genetic profile, and that's fine. You have the privacy, you have the right not to know, and even if you're not at risk for something as devastating as Huntington's, but other people can find out. And obviously, some of the people who might be interested in your genetic predispositions are life and health insurance companies. And recently, Congress passed a bill that would deny insurance companies, in certain cases, in certain circumstances, access to your genetic information in determining whether you're eligible for a policy. So that gives us some protection, but at the same time, if the genetic profile can be conducted for a couple of $100 and an insurance company is looking at you as a client, long-term client, a couple of $100 is really very minimal. They can collect your DNA surreptitiously, right, from saliva on a glass. You don't even know about it. And this is entirely legal. If you're a smoker, a cigarette butt, they can go through your garbage after you throw your garbage out and take out, hair follicles, whatever, and do your DNA analysis, determine that you're a high risk or a low risk, and make decisions on your policy based on that information. You're not even aware of it. And furthermore, you're not even aware necessarily of your own, genetic predispositions and so on. But they know about it.
Isn't that an issue now in criminal investigations where police are taking cigarette butts and garbage of
Yes.
Suspects and
Yep.
using it as evidence? And
Yep.
there's this big issue about whether or not they have the right to that information because they don't have a warrant.
Yeah. This has been decided. And a large part of my time now is also giving presentations like this, teaching science to judges and lawyers, because they're scared to death of this stuff as well. And so what I'm telling you comes from the legal profession who tell me, if you throw something out, it's fair game. If they come into your house to acquire it, then they need a warrant. So the way they can acquire it, and similarly with these insurance companies, they wait until you throw something out that has your DNA on it, and then you've discarded it. You no longer have a connection to it.
Right, even if, not that I would ever find myself in this circumstance.
Of course.
But, even if they're questioning you and offer you a soda, then you just leave that soda can on the table. And
That's been done.
Yeah.
Yeah, that has been done. And I think if you're concerned about that, you want to make sure your attorney is present and that your attorney brings a garbage bag to take all your stuff along with him or her. Yeah. But once you throw it out, it's gone, and anybody can collect it, whether it's the police doing the investigation or an agent for an insurance company or even your nosy neighbor, right? Somebody down the street. Every neighborhood has one of these people. They just have to know what's going on in everyone's lives. And, for a couple of $100 to satisfy your curiosity, pick up your cigarette butt, send it off, and get your genetic profile back. You don't even know about this. Right? These things come up in, they are coming up more and more in court cases and in everyday life. We're going to see it more and more frequently. And society, we haven't dealt with these things yet. And this is just a sampling, right? And just from genomics alone. When we have a poor understanding of science, it leads inevitably to poor public policy. Public policy that has science as a foundation requires an understanding of the science. Right? Not all public policy has a scientific basis, obviously. If we're trying to figure out how to stimulate the economy or something, there's science to economics, some might argue. But generally, for those kinds of political debates, policy debates, you don't necessarily need a PhD in science. But for some of these issues, then you do need good scientific information, right, as a foundation The science will not answer the question. The science will inform the debate, the deliberation, but it won't tell you the answer, because there are other factors that you overlay on top of the scientific foundation that may adjust what the scientists alone would conclude. Okay, example, Mendocino County in California, a couple of years ago, passed a ballot initiative called Measure H, which banned GMOs from the county, right? Largely symbolic. There's very little agriculture in Mendocino anyway, and so the farmers weren't particularly concerned. The few farmers there weren't interested. None of the GM crops really were appropriate for that county anyway. But the debate, and I was involved kind of from the periphery, being in Southern California, watching what was going on there, very poorly informed. One of the things that they got in trouble for was the wording of the ballot, which did pass, and GM crops are now banned from Mendocino County. They redefined DNA as a protein. So DNA is not a protein. DNA is not a protein in the rest of the US or in Europe or anywhere in the world except in Mendocino County, because this is the law. This ballot initiative passed. Not only are GMOs, you cannot cultivate GMOs in Mendocino, but DNA is now a protein, whether you like it or not, in Mendocino County. This is not a well-informed populace, at least not well-informed when it comes to these issues that have a scientific foundation. It also, the wording of the ballot issue also seems to capture, was not the intention, clearly, but things like grapevines, which are important in Mendocino, vaccines, and a number of other products that do not exist in nature, right? Because that was the wording within the ballot initiative was things that are unnatural, that do not occur in nature, are banned. And what they were trying to capture, the people who wrote the wording, were trying to capture products of recombinant DNA technology. Fine. But unwittingly, they also captured things like grapevines, because the grapevines that we grow are actually two different species grafted together. And nature doesn't do that, right? So this is unlikely to be tested in court, because nobody has an interest. Nobody's going to go through the bother of challenging it. But it does tell you, if you're informed on these matters, you look upon that debate in Mendocino County as a microcosm of any other community in either this country or around the world, and you say, those people, they had a faulty foundation. They went into the debate lacking the information they needed to have a vital debate. It's not only in this country. Cartagena Protocol to protect biodiversity from the hazards associated with living modified organisms, which is a subset of genetically modified organisms. The whole concept here was, biotechnology poses a threat to the environment, and in international trade we want to make sure that countries importing these products are safe. Right? They don't want to see places like the US, Canada, Brazil, and Argentina dumping hazardous materials into poorer countries that don't have the regulatory and scientific infrastructure to protect their environment. The problem was that with Cartagena, it was decided finally, after years of discussion involving scientists as well as political folks, the final analysis was determined by a group of people without the scientists. The scientists all went home, and the final wording was chosen by the politicians and the political people, and the result was that they came up with this protocol which looked very good in theory, but it cannot be reduced to practice. So when the politicians came home and said, the US is not a signatory, by the way, but most other countries of the world did sign on to Cartagena. When the politicians came home and gave it to their scientific bureaucrats to say, okay, we've agreed to this now, implement it. The scientists looked at it and said, we can't, right? If you look through the steps, it's like there's a big black hole in the middle, and we don't know how to get from one side of this hole to the other. It just doesn't work. So that means Cartagena probably will collapse. In fact, the indications are that it is collapsing already, that people are just ignoring it, which is unfortunate, but there we have it. The Kyoto Accord, to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Again, the U.S. has not signed this. Most other countries, developed countries, have signed it. Places like Australia, particularly forceful in supporting Kyoto. The problem, though, is that most of the people I've talked to, in spite of the massive international popular support, and even in this country, although our government has not signed it, they think this is a good idea, right? We're all concerned about climate change, and this international accord signed in Kyoto tells us how we're going to deal with it, overcome this climate change problem due to the greenhouse gas emissions. Unfortunately, most of the scientists I've talked to said, even if we do sign on in the U.S. And comply, make a good effort to comply, we're not sure it's actually going to work. So the danger of that is that we the people, who don't have the scientific knowledge about these things are taking the word of our government, of our policymakers, and our scientists and saying, if we comply with Kyoto, we will go a long way towards solving the problem of climate change. When that doesn't happen, when it becomes apparent that that doesn't happen, you've lost credibility, right? The people who don't have the scientific training, and many others, people who do, are going to say, you were wrong, so why should we take your word for anything in the future? And that is extremely damaging to a scientist, particularly a public scientist, when they lose public credibility. Okay, transition. Modern technology is far more complex than it used to be. You can think of the old-fashioned telegraph. Again, our parents and great-grandparents, the devices tended to be mechanical. You could see how they worked, right? There was a gear that went around. There was a little arm that went up and down. And you didn't have to be a genius. You didn't have to be a scientist or engineer to figure out how they worked. And you could deal with that, right? You could incorporate those things or not into your daily life as you saw fit. Nowadays, most things are electronic, the microscopic or nanoscopic, and even virtual. And you can't just look at it and say, oh, okay, now I see how this works. That makes sense. So it's a little bit more removed from our daily experience. And as Arthur C. Clarke said, if it's a sufficiently advanced technology, we can't tell that from magic, right? It looks like magic to us. And certainly, nowadays, so many of these things, I mean, even the cell phone that most of us are using, it seems like magic. It really does, because we don't understand how it all works. And at the same time, in the 21st century, science and technology is far more intrusive than it used to be. Right? In the old days, if you didn't want to take a train, you didn't have to. You didn't want to use a car, even the telephone. A lot of people got by without any difficulty without using these modern inventions. But nowadays, it's increasingly difficult to avoid them. Neurobiology, another area that I do some work in. We talked about the judges and lawyers. Judges are scared to death of this area as well because of the advances in neurobiology. Any neurobiologists in here? Right. Tremendous opportunities there, tremendous advances. Physiology of the brain, how the brain thinks, how it makes decisions, how it decides what to do, and particularly when applied to people who perhaps make bad decisions. Right? You have a gambling addiction. There's a lot of research right now. It's called neuroeconomics, on how people actually make decisions when they know I shouldn't take my grocery money and buy lottery tickets. They know that, but they go ahead and do it anyway. Right? What's going on in their brain? What's going on there? And we're finally starting to get a glimpse of how that works. We had, here's another good example. MRI, magnetic resonance imaging, right? Well, it used to be called nuclear magnetic resonance, but we don't want to scare the public, so we'll just change the name and avoid those concerns, anxieties, questions altogether, right? So that was, entirely marketing for the people who use MRI. We have functional MRI, which is a process that actually shows the results of blood flow, glucose metabolism in the brain. Really interesting stuff. It makes very dramatic pictures and video. Very compelling when you look at these things. And I was trying to find one on YouTube before I came here, and I wasn't able to find one I liked. But you've seen some of these things. I remember I was at a conference where we saw very simple application. There was a person in the machine, and the operator asked a very simple question, right? Like, what's 2 plus 2? And you could see the brain activity, right? The oral centers receiving the question, some processing, action going on through the brain, and then down to the oral to say 4. All right. Really interesting, very compelling. And if you see this stuff, whether on television or particularly in a courtroom, it's very difficult to overcome this. I mean, it's very convincing stuff. PET scans as well, similar kind of modern technology. We're not entirely sure how these things work. And then you add things like the neurotransmitters. Oxytocin is the trust chemical, right? It's a naturally occurring chemical in your brain. When you have a lot of this, plus its receptors, which are equally important, you develop a sense of trust. It's not used recreationally because although people have, if oxytocin is applied artificially, and this has been done, just through the vents, right? We can put oxytocin through the vents here. You'd breathe it in, and you'd have a sense of trusting. But your cognitive will take priority and say, I feel like I should trust this guy who's telling me these things, but I look at him and I don't trust him at all. So you end up not trusting them. So it's not used recreationally, although it has been tried. And these other things as well.
There was just a recent study where there was a big difference in people's ability to get negative feedback. So
Yep.
when they had oxytocin, they were less likely to stop trusting someone who was actually cheating them.
Right, and that was a situation where you didn't know the other person.
Yeah.
Right, so you had the setup where the people were in different rooms, and there was the reward. This is Paul Zach's work, right, at Claremont College, Loma Linda. Really interesting stuff. And if this is interesting now, follow up later on. Just Google neuroeconomics and follow some of the sites you'll get from that. These are chemicals. We've known about these chemicals for a long time. Dopamine, L-DOPA, Parkinson's, and so on. But only now, with the recent advances in neurobiology, neuroimaging, and so on, neurophysiology, we're getting an idea of how it actually works and how it might be manipulated. The concern for us as a scientifically literate society is, can your brain activity indict you? Right? Not only is somebody surreptitiously feeding you oxytocin to make you more trusting so you'll buy this wreck of a car from me at an inflated price, but also if you get in trouble with the police, are they going to be able to do a brain scan and take that into court and explain to the jury that this person obviously is a crook, they've been lying to us, and we can show you this brain scan to show that. And this is something that's a great concern to the legal community. And it's a question that always comes up when I'm doing the workshops with the judges and lawyers. And you can look at certain situations. Empathy, compassion. Normal people will show certain activity in the brain in situations that would elicit normal empathy or compassion with somebody. When you see somebody, being hit in the face with a baseball bat, you cringe. You say, "Oh, that's awful." Some people don't cringe, and they don't show the same kind of activity, brain activity. And you wonder, okay, is this just their normal makeup? Is there a fault in their brain? Can we overcome that fault? And then you have the question of, well, what if this is their natural, normal brain, but it's faulty? Is it ethical to try to overcome what nature gave them? And then other legal questions like, if you show a brain scan of somebody that's associated with, criminal activity, this person has not committed a crime yet, but they have a brain activity that correlates 100% with all the criminals that are in jail. So it's only a matter of time before this person commits a crime. Do we incarcerate them now, even though they've done nothing wrong yet? These questions are actively debated, and they should be, but we need to know the science. Sorry?
Like in Minority Report.
Yeah.
Go. You have to be careful with these because, and I'll tell you, these brain scans, what we're learning with these brain scans is that probably 20% of our population has abnormal brain scans. Right? When you go to court, when you go into a classroom even, you're going to be shown these slides of images of the functional MRI scans and so on, and they're going to show you, this is the criminal, and this is the criminal's brain scan, and they all have this kind of unusual pattern, right? But they don't show you the normal. We have a situation, well, here's just an ordinary X-ray of a normal human brain, right? The skull, cranium, there's the brain inside. And that looks fine. This is the normal person. This is the control. If you are exposed to this image, well, the scientist, the neurobiologist would say, this person is dead. They essentially don't have a brain. If they're alive, they have no real functioning, vegetables essentially. If they have some functioning and can move and so on, they have to be very severely mentally retarded, right? I mean, look at the difference between this person and this person. Well, the fact is, this person with this scan is alive, is functioning, went to the doctor for some unrelated thing and had this scan. This person is a federal bureaucrat. Now, not all federal bureaucrats have this kind of scan. This is actually a federal worker in France. Seems to be perfectly normal. Had hydrocephalus as a child. It compressed the brain tissue against the skull, so the brain here has been pushed out, but apart from being slightly below average intelligence, is otherwise entirely normal. But if we came into court with this picture, right, and I'm the defense attorney and I say, ladies and gentlemen of the jury, clearly my client, has this brain condition and cannot be held responsible for doing all the nasty things he's alleged to have done. And that would be very convincing to you. You have to be careful on these things. Again, it tells us, what we have to watch for. Now, as we said, scientific illiteracy in society is increasing, leads to poor public policy, may be disastrous. If we put all our eggs in one basket, right, whether it's, some controls on, climate change, whatever, we want to make sure that we have solid science before we make the decisions, because once we go down a particular policy route, it's going to be really difficult to come back and start again. Not only will you will have lost the impetus to do the right thing in the first place, you will have lost a lot of public support and credibility, because they'll say, look, we already saw this route and it turned out to be wrong. Why should we trust you to go down this other route? So the question comes, who teaches science to the public? Well, we have choice. Government scientists can be very credible. They can be very effective. They have training. Many of them certainly are very concerned about the public sphere. But they also have a job to follow the party line of whoever happens to be in power. I was invited to a conference from the U.S. Geological Survey several years ago. There were a lot of government scientists there, geologists, climate people, and it was really interesting because they appreciated being there without the political managers. And they were able to discuss amongst themselves, and fortunately they included me, about the data that they were collecting and analyzing and deliberating over this. And so, I learned so much from this closed meeting about what's happening in the climate that you'll never see in the newspapers, because it wasn't filtered through their political bosses. So we don't necessarily trust the government to teach us the basic science. Industry, most people aren't interested in listening to an industry scientist. Their credibility, public credibility is very poor, and almost invariably, people will say, oh, but you're representing, your employer, your stockholders, not the best interests of society at large. And sometimes that's unfortunate, because I know some scientists within industry, excellent scientists. They are very concerned about the state of public knowledge of science. They're very concerned about the climate or agriculture or whatever. But they have no believability. They can't go into public and say, you know, here's my results, here's my interpretation, without somebody saying, oh yeah, but that, you know, you're supporting your industry, not necessarily my interest. So that really falls to public academics, right? People at university. Now the problem with that is that most of us in universities, it's not our job to teach to the public, right? We teach students, we teach our classes within the university, we apply for grants, we conduct research, we publish papers, and we get our merits and promotions based on those factors. Talking to the public, trying to inform the public, doesn't really enter into our career development, and that's unfortunately. I'm just going to skip through this a little bit. How, you know, what we did in the past, the difference between the academic scientist and the government scientist and so on. Yeah, I don't think I need to do this. Okay, can public scientists whose salary is paid from taxpayer funds but whose research is supported privately, as most of us are now, still be considered credible champions of the public good? Okay, the question is, who represents the public good in terms of science policy? Who is going to educate the science in a credible manner, educate the public on scientific matters in a credible manner? And are we public scientists seen as positive resources and advocates for the public good?
What's the role of high school, grade school teachers in all this? I mean, that was really
well, certainly school teachers and science teachers, I see them, and this is just my opinion, I see the school teachers, and even at high school level, as providing the tools, teaching pupils how to use the tools of science. The application of those tools comes at college, at university and beyond, okay? So certainly, you know, I had some excellent science teachers in high school, and that's really why I went into science. But I'm not sure that everyone has had the good fortune, and sometimes it is, you know, just good luck, whether you have good science teachers in high school and prior. But certainly they have a role. I don't know that they have a role so much in the public. You know, they have more demands. I find that the school teachers I know have more demands on their time within the school system than even university professors. So
make a framework that, I mean, the public all went to school for some number of years at some point, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah, but you'll also find, though, that we're getting to the level of complexity with these scientific issues that even those high school science teachers don't know enough to be able to convey the information. Some of them do, certainly, and some of them make an effort. They keep up, you know, they read popular science articles and even technical articles in their field. So certainly there's a role there, but I don't think we can put the entire obligation on their shoulders.
So, as far as I know about American educational system, people in the university and the school, they're relatively free to choose their subjects. So some people can finish school without taking, like, for example, without taking any physics or any biology. So doesn't that transfer to the scientific illiteracy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. And you know, when I talk to, there's two groups of people I talk to who, in many cases, they will say that, you know, I went into this program because it didn't have any science credit responsibilities, obligations, right? This was the only one. So those two fields, journalism, law.
But I think that in a way speaks to what Athena was talking about a little bit earlier about the responsibility of science teachers in primary and secondary school to do a good job, because I never had good science teachers, and I hated science. I didn't do science as an undergraduate. And so in a way, you know, if we don't focus on better training of that population, then scientific illiteracy can continue. And
Absolutely.
In some ways, I see that one of the most important things that academics can do is to train teachers.
Absolutely. No, I agree.
To better students at an earlier age.
And this is particularly true in like biological sciences, because I know several people have talked to me in their school district. You know, they were in teacher training. They were going to become, science teachers at their school. The people who got hired to teach biology were hired because they were coaches, right? They taught gym, and they coached the basketball team. That's the person we really want. And oh, by the way, because they have a degree in kinesiology or something, they can be our biology teacher.
What about the media too? You haven't really spoken to the role of the media.
The role of the media. Media role is crucial, but we have so few science-trained media people. I mean, there's some of them, and there's some very good ones, but there are also some that aren't very good who claim to be science journalists.
But they're certainly teaching the public.
They are teaching the public. Yeah. Yeah, and you're right. The problem is that there's so few of them, right? I mean, how many daily newspapers actually have a science columnist compared to the number of daily newspapers that have a horoscope? Yeah.
This is public scientists and their teaching, at least with high school students and elementary students. I mean, it's one of the things that, as a scientist, you can become involved in those doing outreach programs. A lot of universities do have. You can get a team of grad students together and go out, and you go maybe once a week to the same high school or the same school, and kind of do different things each time. And so you can have a role with these kids.
Yeah.
It may only be once a week, but I mean, it's more than you would be getting if you didn't go, and it can make a great difference.
Absolutely, and that's my that's my take-home lesson. You can get involved. I mean, you're all graduate students now. Eventually, you're going to be out in the world, and I think it behooves you to get involved somehow. If you like dealing with high school kids and want to do that, then volunteer. Go ahead and do that. Right? There are lots of options. You have to, but this is my take-home lesson. We'll get to it early. It's your job. Get out there and help society learn something about the science. Okay? Not necessarily as advocates, but as informers. Provide the basic information and then let them go and have their debate. I think that's the way they should run. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I was concerned about how do we ensure that even public is interested to know about science? I mean, with advent of Google, Wikipedia, there are a lot of tools through which they can be, they have these tools which they can use to know about many different subjects.
Of course, yeah.
But until and unless we make them realize that they have a bearing over the policy making, and it has an effect which might be, where media comes in, these people would not be interested to listen or, to think about whatever we have to tell them.
That's right, and it's unfortunate, but the internet, you're right, some people get a lot of their information, particularly scientific information from the internet, which is absolutely a wonderful source of information, but in the wrong hands, it's a terrible source of information. So people do go on the internet, they go on Wikipedia, they go on other sites, get very nicely packaged information on their issue of concern, whether it's climate change or biotechnology or whatever, and it's wrong. Okay? There's nothing we can do about that except hope that they learn that, with events progressing, that they get to the point that, I had the wrong information, I was misinformed. Maybe I'll go and talk to a credentialed scientist about this, or their website at least. And but if people choose not to listen, we can take the horse to water, but we can't make them drink. At least we could do is provide the water if they so wish to drink. I think there's a question over here.
And if you're going to address this later, you can hold off on it. But do you have any proposals for mechanisms?
Mechanism.
By which this information can be relayed? Because to me, that's sort of what's the big sort of. I think there's a lot of scientists who are willing in terms of engaging with the public and wanting to interact. And, you have a public who wants information, but there's outside of the media. It's hard for me to know how could this occur. Radical kind of proposals.
Oh, sure. I think it's crucial for you as an individual to find the mechanism that you're most interested in, that you're most comfortable with. Okay. So taking that as a global kind of statement, then you go to things like volunteer at your high school. If that's your thing, that's the best way to deliver. If you're interested in it, you're going to be much better at delivering that information. There are other ways. You can have, set up your website, get in that way. You can, local community groups, Like, I've given talks to, everything from international conferences with 2,000 or 3,000 people in the audience to small church groups. People just, word gets around, they call me, I answer my own phone, and they say, we have retirees, right? I had a call from a person who worked in a small club of retirees. They want to keep their brains active. So they have a meeting once a month. They invite, somebody from the university to come and talk about their research and who they are. Really interesting. I met some of these folks, they're 80s and 90 years old, and their brains are really sharp. I was really impressed. But, they talk to me one time. Next month they'll talk to somebody else, and that's great. So that's an opportunity. Church groups, and eventually, just through word of mouth, people get to know you. They get to know, how effective you are at dealing with the public, with the scientifically illiterate public who are still interested in learning something, and it snowballs. Yeah.
Yeah, we do know that significant changes have taken place in terms of science, technology, and society.
Mm-hmm.
They did have implications on lots of factors. One change that really concerns me is like, let's say the scale and the speed of production of novel technologies.
Mm-hmm.
That's really unknown. The side effects of which are unknown.
Mm-hmm.
Really brings along with it uncertainties and risk factors.
Yep.
That are actually unavoidable.
Yeah, I'm going to talk about that a little bit if we have time. So, yeah, but yeah, no, it's absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely.
How do you present those uncertainties and risks, like communicating in the most effective manner?
Yes. Well, okay, let me just jump ahead a little bit. We scientists are more comfortable with risk, right? We equate risk with probability, with uncertainty. So by applying typically, statistical analysis, we come up with a figure. We know about coefficient of variation and standard deviations and so on. So we have a certain degree of comfort. We know very few things. We scientists know very few things for certain, for absolute 100% perfect certainty. So almost everything that we scientists deal with, there's a certain degree of uncertainty there. And we know, where on that range. Are we 99.5% certain, 95% certain, which is the kind of arbitrary cutoff for statistical significance. The public, by and large, doesn't. It's just uncertain. It's a risk, right? Like I was talking to Paul this morning. I was just reading a book called The Science of Fear. Written by a journalist, actually, not even a scientist, talks about things like shark attacks, right? I mean, the horror factor in a shark attack makes that such a big issue for people who are planning, vacation in Southern California, right? We had a shark attack in Southern California this year. Devastating to the tourism industry. But your likelihood of being bitten by a shark are minuscule. And, you're much more likely to get in a car accident or even be hit by lightning. But to the general public, who is less comfortable with uncertainty, that shark attack is a big deal. And how we overcome that, I don't know that we completely overcome it, but instead explain how we use statistical analysis to try to understand uncertainty. We don't like it. I would much prefer to be able to say something with certainty, but as I say, most of the time, we scientists cannot say with certainty. But we can give a measure of variation in that degree of uncertainty, and that gives us some comfort.
If we have a limited amount of time to communicate to the public, how do you propose we sort of allocate that between actually providing information about specific issues versus giving them the tools to be able to process information that they're getting in general?
With a very limited amount of time, my personal method is to give them the tools, and I recommend websites. Websites is a great tool, but stay away from .org sites, stay away from .com sites. Focus on, if you're looking at information rather than advocacy, some of the government sites are excellent, university, the .edu sites, that's where you'll get your basic information. And if you start your deliberations with accurate technical information, not value-driven, but just these are the facts, this is what we know, this is what we don't know, then that's a much better starting point for people. And so that's where we go. Yes, ma'am.
How can scientists be more effective in mass media? Because most people writing are non-scientific people, and it's an effective way of communicating, but you just lose so much in the translation.
Yeah, most of us academic scientists are trained in graduate school the intricacies of communicating with one another. We're very good at writing technical papers. We're very good at giving talks at technical conferences. But any abilities we have to communicate with a wider non-technical audience is essentially beaten out of us in graduate school. Right? So if you have those natural abilities to talk to a group of people who don't have the same technical background, try to maintain that. Right? This is something that in the academy I think we do mistakenly. Right? They're different skills. They are different skills, and if you have that skill, it doesn't mean that you have to, give that up in order to be skilled in the technical delivery. We're certainly not well trained in dealing with the media, and there are courses offered, and I've taken some of these courses, and some of them are very good at understanding where the journalist is coming from, and that is often antithetical to where we come from. If I'm the professor, I stand at the front of the room, I feed you information, and you are supposed to defer to me. I will tell you the important aspects of my lesson today, and you have to remember them. Right? When I'm dealing with a journalist, it's a different story, because when I'm dealing with a journalist, it's the journalist's story. Right? A lot of academic scientists say, okay, I want to see what you've written after we've had this interview, and I'll correct it for you. And the journalist says, not a chance, pal. And that's very difficult for us professors to give up that kind of control. Again, it's a different skill. We can have both. We can cultivate both, and I certainly encourage people to cultivate both.
With the advancement in science and technology, what I understand is there has been the involvement of the private sector more and more into research.
Yes.
So the thing is let's say it has led to the emergence of certain, the production of scientific knowledge has led to the emergence of public texts and private texts.
Yep.
So the question is, this is with regards to the credibility of the scientists, right?
Yep.
Are there any ethical norms? See, it endangers the very ethical norms and regulations that are currently set with respect to the way the scientists and the researchers work. Because how scientific research it works is across multidisciplinary works. There's a peer-to-peer review, there's share of information, and all those things. It's like the concept of universality of knowledge.
Right.
All the groups throughout the world.
Right.
But then this brings up the concept of having impartial sharing of knowledge.
Yep.
Companies don't want to show out everything.
Right.
So is there anything that can be done to curb this to, at least to an extent?
Yeah, there is, but we don't want to pay the price. This started probably 20, 30 years ago, where most academics, and I skipped over the slide, most academics got most of the research funding from the public pot. Okay? That started to diminish, and it was made up, and sometimes we at universities, our deans and our vice presidents told us, you have to get more private funding. So go to the private companies to help fund your research programs. And so there was, some replacement of public funds with private funds. Of course, when the companies give private funds, they want more direction in what kind of work you're going to do. Now, the agreement that I always had when I had these is that, okay, I'll conduct this research program using your private funds, but I have to be free to publish it in, and make it the data publicly available. And if you don't like that, then, we don't have a deal. That was just my personal position. My colleagues would have different positions of how they would deal with private funding. In the last 6 years, I've had to make a personal commitment that I would not accept industry funding at all. Right? Because I do spend so much time in these public fora, and almost invariably people would stand up and say, we can't trust you because you get money from industry. So since you're dependent upon industry for your funding, how do we know that you're giving us the truth? So a number of colleagues and myself have made that policy decision. So I can stand up quite honestly and say, I don't get public or private funding. All of my research funds, plus salary, comes from taxpayers. I had to pay a price for that, because I'm not bringing in as much money into my university as some of my other colleagues who don't have such qualms. But at the same time, they don't talk to the public and come under that same kind of criticism. But you're right. There is a credibility question there, and if you are going to deal with the public, you have to be very careful to maintain your credibility, and that means being very careful when you accept private funds. Okay? I think you can do it, and I think most of my colleagues do that by making that provision that if I take this private money to do this line of research, I have to be free to publish the data widely. And most companies are okay with that. If they have proprietary information, then they will acquire that information, that research information, either in-house with using their own scientists, or through a contract, which is different from a research grant. And in a contract, they can be more specific about the distribution of the final data. And it's usually costing them more, right? I mean, if the taxpayer is paying my salary or my colleague's salary, why should they collect a salary from the public to do private research? Right. So it's doable, but you have to be careful with it.
Do we ask too much of the public in general? I mean, it's not only about biotechnology. I mean, we ask them to know about everything, because we can almost put everything on the ballot nowadays. Or not everything, but a lot of things on the ballot. And I mean, does the even have enough time to inform themselves about, because it takes a lot of time and effort to make the right choice?
You're absolutely right. One of the biggest fears that people have when I start a workshop for non-scientists, for people who are interested in some of these scientific issues, is that I'm going to try to turn them into scientists. And I calm them by saying, that's not the point. We're not going to turn you into scientists. We're trying to teach you how scientists think about questions, how we approach questions, how we collect data, how we analyze data, and so on. But not the technical information, right? You don't need to know the pH of the buffers that I use to extract DNA, right? Who needs to know that? Nobody. But you do need to know that, we extract DNA to do the analysis. But let me just skip ahead in our stuff here and show you some of the things. Okay, some of the issues, some of the points. Public perceptions are often based on invalid assumptions. We've seen this particularly in the Mendocino County. The fear factor, the shark attacks, the unlikely event of a shark attack, yet that really trumps rational thinking. And this is the major one. Right? You don't have to be a scientist to apply critical thinking. You really don't. I mean, scientists have to apply critical thinking when they're trying to analyze the results from their experiments. But everybody can benefit from critical thinking, which simply means, does this make sense? Does my interpretation of this group of information, this body of knowledge, does it make sense? Are there alternative explanations? Do other people, will they look at the same data and come to a different conclusion? Well, why would they come to a different conclusion? Are they putting higher priority on certain aspects that I'm putting lower priority on? To try to understand what these different things are. We talked about this already. There's always going to be some uncertainty. And typically, scientists are more comfortable with uncertainty than non-scientists. And we can, provide some degree of assurance to the concerned, anxious public that uncertainty is okay. It's okay. Just understand what it is and live with it. You won't necessarily control it. You won't overcome it by providing certainty, because a lot of times you're not going to get it. Lack of context is a very common thing, particularly with chemicals. People think that chemicals, first of all chemicals are synthetic, all chemicals are toxic, all chemicals are equally toxic. And this provides a great deal of anxiety for people dealing with anything that seems to have, a chemical sounding name, even if it's something like H2O. And this has been shown over and over again. If you present somebody with a scenario that involves H2O, there'll be a much higher level of anxiety than if you say, well, this is done with water. It's unfortunate, but that happens.
What role do you think that the increased religiosity has on this also, in terms of sort of the rise of fundamentalism and a movement away from more religions that were a little more where there's a lot more theology behind it, and a little more harmonizing with reality versus a strict interpretation of the Bible.
Yeah, I'm just going to skip through this. You're right, and it's not only religiosity, but it's also extreme views of almost any kind. People like to have simple answers, right? And I think, traditionally, religion provided, back Middle Ages, people like to have easy answers that they don't have to think about. Postmodernism, right? If you think something is true, then it is true, even if it isn't true. If you believe strongly enough, and this is the basis of faith, of course, if you believe strongly enough, then that is reality, okay? That's antithetical to science, because scientists should be always willing to accept new evidence that forces them to change their conclusion. Right? As a scientist, as a research scientist, my entire professional career, I actually enjoyed acquiring new evidence that forced me to reevaluate what I thought, what I believed. If you have strong religious beliefs, you don't want to see any evidence that forces you to think about your beliefs. All right? So, there is some conflict there. Now, having said that, don't necessarily want to get into this whole discussion thing, but a lot of scientists do have very strong spiritual beliefs. Okay? And that's what they do, is they segregate, the spiritual world from the natural world. Okay? There's the natural, there's supernatural. And when they look at natural events and the way the universe is unfolding, they can do that in a very scientific way. And then, they go home and they put on their spiritual hat and they have their religious beliefs, and there's no contradiction there, and they're happy with that. So, but yeah, it is difficult when you're talking to any kind of extremist, whether it's political, on the far right, on the far left. They kind of curve around until they meet. They have the same kind of brain set. They have their agenda, they have their beliefs, and any evidence that comes in that seems to contradict that or force them to rethink, they will tend to find a way to discredit that information. So, but it's fun. part of the joys. When we're looking at risk assessment, I don't think we need to spend a lot of time on this, so I'm going to skip through it. Okay, points to ponder. The public is nescient. I don't like to use the word ignorant, because that has a different connotation. Technically, they are ignorant. Nescient means they're unknowing. They just don't know. Sometimes they don't realize they don't know, but they don't know. A lot of scientists also don't know, and people who are supposed to have expertise don't know. I just give this example here. Genetically modified organism. As we saw the problem in the Mendocino County ballot initiative, the wording there, clearly what the people wanted to do was to ban from their county these products of genetic engineering. It sounds really easy on the surface, but when you delve into it, it's not that easy. As I mentioned, with the grapevines, which are unnatural. Internationally, Europe has a definition of GMO. U.S. has definitions of a GMO, or genetically engineered organism, or regulated article. Canada has another one. New Zealand has another one. There's no common definition. So when you get groups of people together and you're talking about policy, the scientists are okay, because they kind of understand what's going on with what people mean by the common definition of a recombinant DNA product. But when you get the regulators and policymakers together, the lawyers, they don't, because they're coming from their own particular background and milieu, their own understanding of what they mean. So it can get very confusing. Back to your point, in science and engineering, the laws of nature dictate reality. Right? Don't really go on beliefs. In policy, perception is reality. So again, we have a contradiction and conflict between the real world, the scientific real world that's measurable, that's tangible, and the political world that isn't always. Right? Politicians respond to what the public wants, or they're supposed to. Even if the public are wrong, the politicians still have to respond to what the public demands. And as we know, some people, they're not interested in the truth. right? They have a particular policy in mind, they have an agenda, and they go forward to support that agenda. Party politics. I think, again, my personal opinion on politics, we've become far too dominated by supporting the party rather than the person or particular policies. And I think this is bad news for democracy, a vital democracy, where we want to have informed debate on the merits and demerits of a particular position, and not simply because, well, my party supports this, so I'm going to support it. Too simplistic. Product versus process. Here's a concept that is often difficult to convey to the public. In Mendocino County, the good citizens there are concerned about the process of genetic engineering, whereas in the scientific realm, there certainly are risks, but they're associated with the final product. And there are certain products that you can derive using either genetic engineering or traditional methods of breeding, right? They're identical at the end of the day. And those two products will present exactly the same risks, whether they're genetically engineered or conventional. There's a rice variety, a disease-resistant rice variety with a resistance gene called XA21. Traditional breeders took many years to transfer this particular gene from a wild type of rice into cultivated rice. Genetic engineers did the same thing, much shorter period of time, but they took exactly the same gene from the same source and put it into the same cultivated rice. So you have these two rice plants, they both have the XA21, they both have disease resistance, but one of them is genetically engineered and the other one is a product of conventional breeding. Whatever risks one of them has, the other one has as well. It's almost like they're identical twins. So, the scientific community is quite happy to accept that argument, but the public, by and large, is not. And they will say, the genetically engineered one causes me more concern, and therefore we have to regulate it as a potentially hazardous product. Media, right? We're talking about the media. They have a job to do. They have a job to do, and I've talked to enough journalists, and some of them are trained specifically in science journalism, and some of them aren't. They have their own job, and they're professionals about it. Some of them are better than others, same as any other profession. Right? But they're not going to come in and interview you, and you are not going to provide them with the same kind of information that you as a professor would to a student who comes to ask questions about your course. Right? It's a different relationship, and you have to, again, come to terms with that kind of uncertainty and recognize that you're across the table much more so as equals than the professor-student kind of relationship. Okay, we live under the laws of nature. I'm going to wrap this up so we can continue the discussion. This again goes back to some of the points you made about the religiosity and the political perceptions. We can't change the value of pi. We can't change the value of pi by fiat, by democracy. We just don't have that power, right? Nature's in control. So no matter how popular it might be, no matter how much easier it would be for engineers if pi were equal to 3.0, it isn't. And we have to accept that. So we do run into trouble when we ignore nature to try to support policy that runs counter to nature. So we have to have an appreciation for what nature tells us is the unfolding of the universe, and the universities, I suppose, when we're developing policy, and certainly public education. Scientific illiteracy threatens civilization. I'm very concerned when I talk to people who have no interest in science. They have their beliefs, their perceptions of the way the world should work. They have no interest in learning the science, and I see society really splitting into two groups. Those people who have some ability to deal with science, speak science, understand scientific thinking, and others who don't. And I think, similar to, a century ago, society was split, our society was split into literate and illiterate. And the illiterate got left behind. And I think in this in this century, the lesson is that the scientifically illiterate are going to be left behind. And I don't think that's healthy for us. I think that's going to cause us some great consternation in the future. So again, I exhort you all, as graduate students and people interested in science, to help people understand something about science without necessarily taking, an advocacy position. It's our responsibility as academics, right, as public scientists particularly, and we will continue to suffer from poor policy decisions until people are more scientifically literate and able to debate, deliberate on these issues. Who else is going to do it? Right? If there's a void there, we saw this in Britain, in the UK, several years ago in the GM debate, when their government said, this mad cow disease is vastly overblown. You don't have to worry about our beef. Go ahead and eat it. It's safe. Our scientists tell us that our beef is safe. And it turned out, of course, not to be. And so many people came down with the variant form of CJD, and the credibility was destroyed. Right? So the public trust in government agencies, the people who should be looking after their best interest, plummeted to single figures. And they're still recovering from that. 20 years later, they're still recovering from that. Once you lose somebody's credibility and trust, it's really difficult to get it back. So, a crucial factor, you have personal integrity, keep it. You want to maintain that at all costs. There was a void, right? So after that, with these scientific issues, and particularly with agriculture and food production, they've had so many food scares in Europe, far more than we have on this side of the Atlantic. And not just mad cow disease and CJD, but a whole series of other disasters in the food supply, such that the people just didn't believe either academic scientists or government scientists. They never believed industry scientists. So there's a void there. And a whole bunch of different groups with an agenda rushed in to say, we will tell you what to believe, right? We are looking after your best interest. Here's how we should proceed with these policies. And some of those groups were honestly interested in the public good and tried to do a good job of providing information and so on, and others weren't. They had a political agenda and pursued that, although it was covert. Demand and practice the highest ethical standards for yourself and your colleagues. Again, integrity. Once you lose trust, once you lose your integrity, good luck getting it back. Transparency. Again, I keep saying this. I'm paid by taxpayers, so that's my loyalty is to taxpayers. If they want to look over my shoulder while I'm doing an experiment, fine with me. A lot of scientists say no, and my position is, it's not necessarily that people want to tell me what to do or what I'm doing wrong, but they're curious as to what I'm doing, right? They're paying me. They want to know where the money's going. And I think they have a right to know that. So I have comfort if, really very few people ever follow up on that. And not necessarily literally looking over my shoulder, but just saying, okay, what are you doing these days? How are you spending the money that I'm paying you? And I'm happy to talk to them. They're willing to, if they're interested enough to contact me and ask, I think they deserve a few minutes of my time. If everybody out there had the same same program, obviously I wouldn't be able to do that. But as long as it's a relatively small number, it's okay. Outreach and public education. Right? I've been talking about this all along. I think it's great. Media and public policy training for scientists. Most scientists really don't want to have anything to do with this. And I have colleagues, when I first took the job at University of California, I had colleagues who welcomed me there. Thank God you're here. Now whenever I get wackos calling me, I can transfer them to you. Most academic scientists, their job description is teaching and research. It's not outreach, it's not public education, and even if they do volunteer to go talk to a church group or a local community group, they're not rewarded for it. I mean, the dean says, why are you wasting your time doing that? Right? You could have written another grant proposal. So you really have to be dedicated to this cause, because it does negatively impact your career if you're a typical academic scientist. So I really don't recommend doing this in a big way until you have tenure. I have tenure. We also have to deal, I love dealing with people who challenge me intellectually, and dealing with people who come from outer space, figuratively, that's a lot of fun, right? Alternative epistemologies. You know, I mention alternative epistemologies to my colleagues, and they have no idea what I'm talking about. And again, I keep harping on this, build and retain trust, because really it's, at the end of the day, that's all you have. Finally, these are not empty words. I mean, a lot of you have seen these before. Gandhi, you must be the change you wish to see in the world. All right? If you want to make the world a better place, start with yourself. And, you know, education is the most powerful weapon you can use. If you believe these statements, these thoughts, then, you know, instead of saying, oh, those are nice platitudes to end with, you have to live them. You have to live them. And knowing that you'll never succeed 100% doesn't mean that you shouldn't try, and make sure you get back on the wagon if you ever fall off, as you almost certainly will. Okay, thanks very much. I think we still have a little time for some discussion before lunch. Do we? Thanks. Right? Thank you.
Probably 2 or 3 questions for lunch.
Something that didn't.
You had your hand up first. The first one I saw, anyway.
But I have been wondering, to what extent do you think that scientists have an ethical responsibility to the public to pursue certain research questions that the public needs to have information on? Mm-hmm. So one of the questions that came up earlier was about some of the new nanotechnologies and the risks associated with them. Mm-hmm. Like, to what extent would a scientist who has public funds be responsible to research those risks over something that maybe seems a little bit more intellectually sexy or interesting?
Yeah. Well, I think it's crucial. You know, I'm not as up on the nanotech, but certainly in the biotech field, you know, biotech, of course, there's a lot of public concern over biotech and the risks associated with biotech. And in the scientific community, similarly, we recognize there are risks. There's risks with every activity. And the people who are developing biotech for applications for crop improvement or whatever, you know, we need to know. We need to have some handle on what the risks are, and are they manageable risks or not, and use that information. So the person can either do it themselves, the person who's developing the product, they can either do it themselves with their colleagues, or we can have more of a policy-driven thing where somebody entirely independent can look at that product and say, okay, what are the risks associated with that? And low profile, but we do, and most developed countries do have research funds going to what's called biosafety. And you know, I was managing a USDA grant panel a couple of years ago. That was our mandate, right? We had $3 million to distribute to competitive proposals to investigate risks associated with products of biotechnology. So that work is being done, and that's all in the public domain. It's, you know, the results are all published, but they don't get in the newspapers because most of the time it's boring. So,
This
yes.
will have to be the last question.
Oh, sorry. Who is next? Yeah.
How do you suggest scientists should address disputes, scientific disputes? I mean, there are many research in which people are, even scientists are not very sure about, they have different takes on it. Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if you believe that probably this is what should be, I mean, I'm just talking in reference to toxicity of various things.
Yeah.
There are scientists whose studies indicate that they are toxic, or there are studies which indicate that they might not be toxic. Mm-hmm. So there are different scientists which have different takes on this. Mm-hmm. So how, I mean, and these are critical issues. Yeah. So how do you expect one's personal beliefs should be addressed to public? I mean, mm-hmm. they can be confused from these different takes, and it can result in controversy. Sure.
Well, you know, this is the lifeblood of science, right? It's different scientists who have expertise, common expertise, looking at the same set of data and coming to different interpretations, right? That's what makes science go. We love it. It doesn't get in the public, you know, it doesn't become a public fight, But the discussions and deliberations within the scientific community, that's what really makes us all tick, because that happens every day with every research project. The way I suggest we approach that, particularly, you have the two belligerents, A and B, and they're fighting over the same set of data. If I'm kind of an interested outsider and I want to help them get together to mediate, what I say is, go back to where you have common ground. Find out where you agree, which facts do you agree on, and then slowly build upon that until you find where you diverge, right? And then, try to isolate what is it that you're actually arguing about. What's causing that initial division back where you had a common foundation? Okay, and then take it from there. But it's got to be up to them, because they're the experts. Right? They're the experts. They have the credentials. And most of the time, I find that scientists who do that, if they're unable to recognize that initial source, at least they will have some respect for the other person's view and take that into consideration as they're thinking about these things. It's one of the beauties of peer review. Right? Some people hate the idea of peer review because they're going to send my ideas out to some anonymous person who's going to slam them, and then, of course, I feel bad because this person, is essentially slamming me personally. It's not a personal thing, and I would much rather, when I have my manuscript sent off to peer review and they come back and there's red ink all over them, I'm thinking, oh, thank God some anonymous person told me about this before it went public. And I'm able to correct or argue. Sometimes it's a clarification. I didn't explain this point well enough, and the person who read it, the anonymous reviewer, read it and misinterpreted it. Okay, that's good news as well, because that gives me the chance to say, okay, I can understand how somebody else could read this and interpret it that way. I didn't think of that before, so I can clarify my writing.
Well, let's thank Alan again.
Thank you.